Tyler's cruelty toward the old foreman was devastating to witness. He called Frank worthless, outdated, a failure, never knowing he was destroying a man who had lost everything through betrayal. When the truth emerged, Tyler's tears of shame would transform into something beautiful, the rebirth of a soul. Tyler Hamilton stepped onto the construction site like he owned every grain of dust beneath his polished leather shoes. At 28, fresh out of MIT with a civil engineering degree that had cost his parents more than most people earned in 3 years, he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that made seasoned workers instinctively step aside. His crisp white button-down shirt remained wrinkle-free despite the Denver morning heat, and his designer hard hat gleamed like a beacon of superiority among the weathered, dented helmets of the crew. Tyler adjusted his expensive sunglasses and surveyed the cornerstone construction site with the disdain of a food critic entering a roadside diner. "What a mess," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby workers to hear. "How do these people expect to finish anything on schedule with this level of organization?" The morning sun cast long shadows across the site, but Tyler's shadow seemed to stretch further than the others, darker, colder, carrying the weight of judgment that would soon crush an innocent man's spirit. From across the site, workers glanced nervously in his direction. Some exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen his type before. Young engineers who arrived like conquering generals, armed with theories but lacking the scars that came from real experience. But something about Tyler felt different. His arrogance cut deeper, sharper, like a blade designed specifically to wound. "Where's the site supervisor?" Tyler's voice boomed across the construction area, interrupting the steady rhythm of hammers and machinery. "I need to speak with whoever's running this disaster immediately." Near the east corner of the site, a figure emerged from behind a stack of lumber. Frank Thompson moved with the deliberate pace of a man whose joints carried the memory of 40 years in construction. His 67-year-old frame was still strong, but time had etched wisdom lines around his eyes and silver through his thinning hair. His hard hat, faded blue and marked by countless impacts, sat comfortably on his head like an old friend. "Good morning, son," Frank called out as he approached, extending a calloused hand that told stories of thousands of buildings born from nothing. "I'm Frank Thompson, the foreman. You must be our new engineer." Tyler stared at the outstretched hand, as if it were contaminated. Not only did he refuse the gesture, but he physically recoiled, taking a step backward that felt like a slap across Frank's weathered face. The construction site seemed to hold its breath. A few workers stopped their tasks entirely, sensing something ugly about to unfold. "Foreman?" Tyler's laugh was cruel, sharp enough to cut glass. "So you're the one responsible for this chaos?" The word chaos dripped from his lips like poison, each syllable designed to humiliate. Frank's hand slowly lowered to his side, but his expression remained patient, kind. The face of a man who had weathered storms far worse than arrogant young engineers. "Sir, if you'd like, I can walk you through our current processes," Frank began, his voice steady despite the public embarrassment. "Processes?" Tyler interrupted, his voice rising to ensure every worker could hear. "You call this mess a process? Let me tell you something, old man. I didn't spend 5 years at MIT studying advanced structural engineering to take advice from someone who probably learned construction from a handbook older than my car." The cruelty in Tyler's voice made several workers flinch. Miguel Rodriguez, a veteran electrician, stopped drilling and turned toward the confrontation. Sarah Chen, one of the few female workers on site, shook her head in disgust. Even the youngest laborers recognized something fundamentally wrong with what they were witnessing. Frank's eyes showed a flicker of pain, not for himself, but for the young man who clearly carried such anger inside him. "Son, experience and education both have their place." "Don't call me son," Tyler snapped, stepping closer to Frank in a display of intimidation that made the older man seem suddenly frail. "And don't lecture me about experience. Do you know what my starting salary is? Do you have any idea what companies pay for real expertise?" Tyler gestured wildly around the site, his movements theatrical and designed for maximum humiliation. "Look at this place. Materials scattered everywhere. Workers standing around talking instead of working. Equipment that belongs in a museum. This isn't a construction site. It's a retirement home for has-beens." Each word landed like a physical blow. Frank's shoulders sagged slightly. not from weakness, but from the weight of undeserved shame being piled upon him in front of men who looked up to him. In the distance, David Richardson's pickup truck pulled into the site. The project manager had arrived for his morning inspection, completely unaware that his new engineer was systematically destroying the respect and dignity of the man who had built half of Denver's skyline. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Tyler continued, his voice now carrying across the entire site like a toxic fog. "I see everything that's wrong with American construction. Outdated methods, resistance to innovation, stubborn old-timers who refuse to accept that their time is over." Tyler paused, savoring the moment like a predator playing with wounded prey. Around the site, workers had stopped pretending to work. Some stared in shock, others looked away in embarrassment for Frank, but all of them felt the poisonous atmosphere Tyler was creating. "I've been hired to bring this company into the 21st century, Tyler announced, now addressing not just Frank, but the entire crew. "And that means anyone who can't keep up with modern methods needs to find somewhere else to spend their golden years." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the machinery seemed to have stopped, as if the very equipment was horrified by what it had witnessed. Frank Thompson stood perfectly still for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes studying the young man who had just attempted to demolish his reputation and self-worth in front of his crew. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet dignity that made Tyler's shouting seem like the tantrum of a spoiled child. "Mr. Hamilton," Frank said softly, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I do represent the past, but sometimes understanding the past is essential for building a solid future. Save the fortune cookie wisdom for someone who cares," Tyler shot back, turning his back on Frank with theatrical dismissal. "I have real work to do." As Tyler strode toward the site office, his expensive shoes clicking against concrete, he left behind a poisoned atmosphere thick with tension and disgust. The workers slowly returned to their tasks, but the comfortable camaraderie that had existed moments before was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that they had just witnessed something genuinely cruel. Frank remained standing in the same spot for several seconds, watching Tyler's retreating figure. His expression showed no anger, no desire for revenge, only a deep sadness for a young man so consumed by his own importance that he had forgotten the basic human decency their mothers had surely tried to teach them. "Mr. Thompson," Miguel approached quietly, his voice filled with barely controlled anger. "You're not going to let that kid talk to you like that, are you?" Frank placed a gentle hand on Miguel's shoulder and smiled with the wisdom that came from decades of dealing with difficult people. "Miguel, my friend, life has a way of teaching humility to those who need it most. And something tells me that young man is about to receive an education that no university could provide. But sir, trust me, Miguel. Sometimes the best way to show someone who you really are is to let time and circumstances speak for themselves." In the site office, Tyler was already opening his laptop, mentally cataloging all the changes he would implement to drag this backward operation into the modern era. Through the dusty window, he watched Frank walking slowly among the workers and felt a surge of satisfaction at having established his dominance so quickly. Tyler had no idea that he had just humiliated a man who had designed some of Denver's most iconic buildings, who had trained 3 generations of construction workers, who had saved lives through his expertise and touched countless hearts through his kindness. He had no idea that Frank Thompson was not just a foreman, but a legend. But life, as Frank knew better than most, had its own way of teaching lessons to those who needed them most desperately. And Tyler Hamilton's education was about to begin, 4 days after the humiliation. Tyler Hamilton woke up that morning with the intoxicating sensation of a man who believed he was reshaping the world according to his vision. The past few days had been a symphony of changes. He had reorganized the entire workflow, relocated material storage areas, and introduced what he proudly called efficiency protocols that would drag this backward site into the modern age. His reflection in the bathroom mirror of his downtown Denver apartment showed a man drunk on his own perceived brilliance. Every morning ritual, the precise shaving, the selection of his imported cologne, the careful arrangement of his MIT class ring, reinforced his conviction that he was saving this company from itself. "Today I'll show that stubborn old fool how real engineering works," he murmured to himself. practicing the condescending smile he planned to wear when Frank inevitably came crawling to him for guidance. When Tyler arrived at the site, something felt different. The usual morning energy seemed muted, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that made him pause at the entrance. Workers moved with a strange urgency, clustering in small groups and speaking in hushed tones that stopped abruptly when they noticed him approaching. "Morning, everyone," Tyler called out with false cheerfulness, but his greeting was met with uncomfortable silence and averted eyes. Miguel Rodriguez was the first to approach, his weathered face showing lines of worry that hadn't been there the week before. His calloused hands fidgeted with his hard hat as he walked, and Tyler noticed the way other workers watched the interaction from a distance, their expressions tense with anticipation. "Mr. Hamilton," Miguel began, his voice carrying a tremor that immediately put Tyler on edge. "We need to discuss something about the second-floor structural modifications you implemented." Tyler's jaw tightened with irritation. He had been dealing with resistance to his changes all week, and his patience for what he considered backward thinking had evaporated completely. "What about them?" Tyler snapped, not bothering to look up from his tablet where he was reviewing his revolutionary new scheduling system. Miguel swallowed hard, glancing back at his fellow workers who had formed a semicircle at a respectful distance. The morning sun cast long shadows behind them, making the group look like a jury delivering a verdict. "Sir, following the changes you made to the load distribution, the main support beam on the second floor," Miguel's voice faltered, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. "It's showing signs of structural stress." The words hit Tyler like ice water. "What kind of signs?" he demanded, finally looking up from his device. "Cracking, sir. A significant crack that appeared overnight." The tablet nearly slipped from Tyler's suddenly sweaty palms. Around the site, he could see workers exchanging glances, some worried, others carrying expressions that looked disturbingly like, "I told you so." The comfortable superiority he had worn like armor began to crack along with the beam Miguel described. "That's impossible," Tyler declared, but his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "My calculations were perfect. I used the most advanced structural analysis software available." Even as he spoke the words, Tyler's eyes were already searching the site for Frank Thompson. The old foreman was standing near the concrete mixer, surrounded by a group of younger workers who hung on his every word. Frank's weathered face showed no satisfaction at Tyler's predicament, only the deep concern of a man who had seen structural failures before and understood their potential consequences. "Let me see this supposed crack," Tyler said, trying to reclaim his authority, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his growing panic. The walk to the second floor felt like a death march. Each step on the temporary wooden staircase echoed with the sound of Tyler's arrogance crumbling. Behind him, he could hear the soft murmur of workers following at a distance, their whispered conversations creating a soundtrack of judgment. When Tyler saw the crack, his world collapsed. It wasn't a hairline fissure that could be dismissed or easily repaired. The crack ran nearly 4 feet along the main support beam, zigzagging through the concrete like a lightning bolt of destruction. Small pieces of concrete had already begun to fall, creating a pile of debris on the floor below that looked like the remnants of Tyler's shattered confidence. "Jesus Christ," Tyler whispered, the color draining from his face as he stared at the evidence of his catastrophic error. "Mr. Hamilton," Frank's calm voice came from behind him. The old foreman had climbed the stairs silently, his decades of experience allowing him to move through construction sites like a ghost. "Mind if I take a look?" Tyler turned slowly, and for the first time since arriving at the site, he looked at Frank Thompson without arrogance or disdain. What he saw was a man whose eyes held no mockery, no satisfaction at Tyler's downfall, only genuine concern and a depth of knowledge that Tyler was finally beginning to recognize. I don't understand," Tyler stammered, his usual eloquence reduced to the confused mumblings of a child who had broken something precious. The software confirmed every calculation. "The load distribution was optimal, according to every engineering principle I learned." Frank approached the damaged beam with the careful precision of a surgeon examining a patient. His weathered hands moved along the concrete, feeling textures and stress patterns that Tyler's expensive education had never taught him to recognize. "The software wasn't wrong, son," Frank said gently, without a trace of condescension. "But software can only work with the information it's given." Tyler felt something strange stir in his chest at Frank's use of the word son. There was no mockery in it, no sarcasm, just the patient tone of someone who had seen this kind of mistake before and understood the panic that came with it. "What do you mean?" Frank pointed to a specific area where the crack originated. "When you relocated the steel storage area last week, you concentrated all that weight over this particular section. The concrete could handle it under normal circumstances, but..." Tyler followed Frank's gaze downward, through the second floor to the ground below. "But what?" "This section of the foundation sits over what used to be an underground stream. The city filled it in during construction, but the soil underneath has different compression characteristics than the rest of the foundation." Tyler felt his stomach drop to his feet. "That's not in any of the geological surveys." "No, it wouldn't be," Frank replied patiently. "That information comes from working on this land for quite a few years." The silence that followed was deafening. Tyler realized that every worker on the second floor was watching him, waiting to see how he would respond to this devastating revelation. "How long?" Tyler's voice cracked like the beam above them. "How long before the structure fails?" Frank's expression grew more serious as he examined the crack more closely. "If we keep the current load distribution, maybe a week, possibly less." "The concrete is already showing signs of progressive failure." Tyler slumped against a support post, his legs suddenly unable to hold his weight. The magnitude of his mistake crashed over him like a wave, washing away every trace of arrogance and leaving behind only the terrified realization that people could die because of his hubris. "I've ruined everything," Tyler whispered, his voice breaking completely. "I've destroyed the project, probably cost people their jobs. Maybe worse." Frank watched the young man's complete breakdown with the same compassion he might show to one of his own sons. Without hesitation, he moved closer and placed a gentle hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Son," Frank said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of a father comforting a child after a nightmare. "Take a deep breath. This isn't the end of the world. But the company, the workers, the safety violations..." Tyler looked up at Frank with eyes that showed genuine fear and remorse for the first time since arriving at the site. "Tyler," Frank said, using his first name with the familiarity of someone who had decided this young man deserved patience rather than punishment. "I've been in construction for 40 years. I've seen mistakes that would make your hair turn white overnight, but I've also seen them fixed by people who were willing to swallow their pride and accept help." "Help?" Tyler repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. Frank knelt down beside Tyler, bringing himself to eye level like a parent talking to a scared child. "Son, you made an error. A big one, yes, but not an unfixable one. The question is, are you willing to let someone with experience guide you through making it right?" Tyler stared into Frank's weathered face, seeing for the first time the kindness that had been there all along, hidden behind his own prejudice and arrogance. "You would help me? After the way I treated you?" Frank's smile was gentle, understanding, and completely free of any desire for revenge. "Tyler, one of the most important things I've learned in my life is that everybody deserves a second chance, especially young people who are brave enough to admit when they're wrong. But I humiliated you in front of everyone. I called you incompetent, outdated." "Son," Frank interrupted gently. "Those were just words spoken by someone who was scared and trying to prove something to himself. I've got thick enough skin to handle worse than that. What matters now is whether you're ready to learn." Tyler felt tears burning behind his eyes, not tears of frustration or anger, but tears of gratitude for a kindness he didn't deserve. "Mr. Thompson, Frank, I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know where to start." Frank stood and extended his hand to Tyler, the same hand that Tyler had rejected so coldly just days before. This time, Tyler grasped it without hesitation, allowing Frank to pull him to his feet. "First thing we need to do is secure this area and redistribute the load," Frank said, his voice taking on the confident tone of a master craftsman who had solved similar problems countless times. "Then we'll work on a proper repair plan that addresses the soil compression issue." "We?" Tyler asked, hardly daring to hope. "We," Frank confirmed with a nod. "But Tyler, there's something you need to understand. From this point forward, you're going to have to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Tyler looked at this man who had every right to hate him, who instead was offering to save his career and possibly his life, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. For the first time since graduating from MIT, Tyler Hamilton felt like a student again. "Yes, sir," Tyler said quietly. "I'll trust you completely." Frank's smile broadened, and Tyler caught a glimpse of the warmth and wisdom that had earned this man the respect of every worker on the site. "Good. Now let's get to work. We've got a beam to save and a young engineer to teach." 2 hours later, David Richardson arrived at the site to find Tyler and Frank working side by side, developing a comprehensive repair plan. Richardson had expected to find chaos, panic, and possibly the need to fire his newest engineer. Instead, he discovered Frank Thompson patiently explaining foundation dynamics to Tyler, who listened with the attentiveness of a devoted student. "What's the situation?" Richardson asked, approaching the unlikely pair. "Mr. Richardson," Tyler began, his voice steady but humble. "I made a serious error in judgment that compromised the structural integrity of the second floor. However, Frank, Mr. Thompson, has developed a solution that will not only repair the damage, but make the structure stronger than the original design." Richardson raised an eyebrow at Tyler's dramatically different tone and demeanor. "And you're confident in this solution?" Tyler looked at Frank with something approaching reverence. "Sir, I'm confident in Mr. Thompson's expertise. He understands this site and these materials in ways that no textbook could ever teach me." Frank placed a supportive hand on Tyler's shoulder. "The boys learned from his mistake, David. Sometimes that's worth more than getting it right the first time." Richardson studied the two men, the humbled young engineer and the patient old master, and realized he was witnessing something more significant than just problem-solving. He was seeing the birth of a mentorship that might transform both men. "All right," Richardson said finally. "Frank, you take the lead on this repair. Tyler, you assist and learn." "And Tyler?" "Yes, sir." "Next time you think you know everything, remember this moment." Tyler nodded solemnly. "I don't think I'll ever forget it, sir." As Richardson walked away, Frank turned to Tyler with the satisfied expression of a teacher who had just watched his student take the first step toward wisdom. "Ready for your real education to begin, son?" Frank asked. Tyler smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn since arriving at the site. "Ready, Mr. Thompson, and thank you for everything." Frank patted Tyler's back with the affection of a father proud of his son's growth. "That's what we do for family, Tyler. And whether you realize it or not, that's what we are now." For the first time in his life, Tyler Hamilton understood that the most valuable lessons couldn't be downloaded, purchased, or earned with a degree. They could only be given by someone who cared enough to see past your mistakes to the person you could become. And Frank Thompson had just given him the greatest gift of his life, a second chance, wrapped in the kind of unconditional love that only comes from the heart of a true teacher. 1 week after the beam incident, Tyler Hamilton had never imagined that wearing a tool belt could feel like wearing a Medal of Honor. The leather was rough against his skin, the weight unfamiliar on his hips, but every morning when he strapped it on, he felt connected to something larger than himself, to the tradition of builders that Frank Thompson represented. The past week had transformed Tyler in ways his MIT professors could never have predicted. His hands, once soft and manicured, now bore the honest calluses of real work. His expensive shirts had been replaced by practical work clothes that showed the stains of genuine effort. Most importantly, his heart had begun to soften under Frank's patient mentorship. "Tyler, hand me that level," Frank called from where he was carefully checking the alignment of the new support structure they had installed. The old foreman's voice carried the easy familiarity of a father working alongside his son on a weekend project. "Yes, sir," Tyler responded immediately, retrieving the tool with the eagerness of someone who had discovered the joy of being useful rather than just being right. The repair work on the second floor had become more than just fixing Tyler's mistake. It had become a masterclass in humility, craftsmanship, and the kind of problem-solving that could only be learned through experience. Frank had shown Tyler how to feel the subtle vibrations in concrete that indicated stress, how to read the language of materials that spoke through sight, sound, and touch. "You're getting better at this, son," Frank said as Tyler handed him the level. "Few more months, and you might actually be worth the salary they're paying you." Tyler laughed, a sound that would have been impossible just weeks before. "Only a few months? I was hoping for a few decades?" Frank's weathered face crinkled into a smile. The relationship between them had evolved from antagonistic to paternal, built on a foundation of mutual respect that grew stronger with each shared task. Just before noon, the sound of a car door slamming echoed across the construction site with unusual urgency. Tyler and Frank were 40 feet up on the scaffolding, but even at that distance, they could hear the desperation in a woman's voice as she called out to anyone who would listen. "Please, somebody help me. My daughter. She's pregnant and our house is falling down around her." Tyler and Frank exchanged glances. Frank's expression immediately shifted from the relaxed mentorship of moments before to the alert concern of someone who had heard genuine distress. Without a word, he began climbing down the scaffolding with the quick efficiency of a man half his age. Tyler followed, his heart already racing with an anxiety he couldn't quite name. Something about the raw panic in that woman's voice triggered a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. At ground level, they found Linda Johnson standing near the site entrance, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the arm of a security guard who looked completely overwhelmed by her desperation. Linda was a woman in her early 50s, wearing a simple floral dress that had seen better years, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that spoke of someone who had more important things to worry about than appearance. "Ma'am, please calm down," the guard was saying, his voice uncertain. "I can't just let anyone onto the construction site. There are safety regulations." "Safety?" Linda's voice cracked with hysteria. "My daughter is 8 months pregnant and the ceiling in her bedroom is about to cave in. We don't have anywhere else to go, and I don't have money to pay for help." Tyler felt something twist painfully in his chest as he watched this woman's desperation. A week ago, he would have walked past without a second thought, dismissing her as someone else's problem. But Frank's patient mentorship had begun to open his eyes to the humanity that surrounded him every day. Frank approached Linda with the gentle manner of someone accustomed to comforting people in crisis. "Ma'am, I'm Frank Thompson, the foreman here. What's your name?" "Linda Johnson," she managed between sobs. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know where else to turn. The city housing department said it would take weeks for an inspection. And my daughter, Sarah, she could go into labor any day." Frank's entire demeanor shifted into what Tyler was beginning to recognize as his problem-solving mode. "Mrs. Johnson, where is your daughter's house?" "Just 6 blocks from here on Maple Street. It's a little rental house that looked fine when she moved in. But with all the rain we've been having..." Linda's voice trailed off as fresh tears began to flow. Tyler found himself stepping forward before he had consciously decided to speak. "Mrs. Johnson, what exactly is happening with the ceiling?" Linda looked at Tyler with surprise, as if she hadn't expected the young man in work clothes to address her directly. "There are cracks running across the entire bedroom ceiling, and yesterday a piece of plaster fell right onto Sarah's bed. She's too pregnant to sleep anywhere but lying down, but it's not safe for her to be in that room." Frank was already moving toward his truck, his sense of urgency palpable. "Tyler, grab the emergency kit from the office. Mrs. Johnson, we're going to take a look at your daughter's house right now." Tyler felt his chest tighten with emotion as he watched Frank immediately spring into action. There was no hesitation, no calculation of cost or benefit, just the immediate response of a man who saw someone in need and couldn't rest until he had tried to help. "Wait," Tyler called out, jogging to catch up with Frank. "What about our work here? What about the repair schedule?" Frank turned to Tyler with an expression of gentle surprise. "Son, what good is fixing concrete and steel if we ignore the people who need our help? The building will wait an hour. That young mother might not have an hour to spare." The simple humanity of Frank's response hit Tyler like a physical blow. Here was a man who had been publicly humiliated, who was working on a crisis that could have cost him his job. And his first instinct when hearing about someone else's emergency was to drop everything and help. 20 minutes later, the Johnson house was even worse than Linda had described. The small 2-bedroom rental property looked like it was being slowly crushed by its own weight. Cracks spider-webbed across the exterior walls, and Tyler could see clear signs of foundation settlement that had probably been developing for months. Sarah Johnson sat on the front porch, her hands resting on her enormously swollen belly, looking like a woman who had reached the end of her emotional reserves. She was barely 22, with the kind of exhausted beauty that comes from carrying life while struggling to survive. When she saw her mother returning with 2 strangers, her face showed a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Mom, who are these people?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been disappointed too many times. "This is Mr. Thompson and Tyler," Linda explained quickly. "They're from the construction company, and they came to help." Frank approached Sarah with the careful respect of someone who understood that pregnancy made women both precious and vulnerable. "Miss, I'm Frank Thompson. With your permission, I'd like to examine your house and see what we're dealing with." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate you coming, but I can't pay for repairs. I'm a single mother working part-time at a grocery store, and with the baby coming—" "Nobody asked you to pay for anything," Frank interrupted gently. "Sometimes help comes just because it's the right thing to do." Tyler watched this interaction with growing amazement. Frank's natural compassion was transforming a desperate situation into something that felt almost hopeful. The old foreman had a way of making people feel valued and cared for that Tyler had never witnessed before. Inside the house, the situation was indeed critical. The bedroom ceiling showed massive stress cracks that indicated imminent failure. Water damage from recent storms had weakened the support structure, and Tyler could see that the entire room was essentially a disaster waiting to happen. "This is bad," Tyler whispered to Frank as they examined the damage. "Really bad." Frank nodded grimly. "The support joists are compromised, and there's water damage that goes deeper than what we can see. This ceiling could come down tonight, tomorrow, or in an hour. We can't predict it." Tyler felt his stomach clench with anxiety. "What do we do?" Frank turned to him with an expression that was both serious and educational. "Tyler, this is one of those moments where you find out what kind of man you really are. We can walk away and say it's not our problem, or we can figure out how to help these women." Tyler looked back at Sarah, who was sitting on a broken couch with her hands protectively covering her unborn child, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The comfortable distance he had always maintained between himself and other people's problems suddenly felt not just wrong, but cruel. "What would it take to fix this properly?" Tyler asked. Frank surveyed the damage with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every kind of structural problem imaginable. Complete ceiling replacement, new support joists, probably some foundation work to address the underlying settlement issues. "We're talking about a substantial repair job." "How substantial?" $8,000 to $10,000 minimum. Maybe more if we find additional problems once we start opening things up. Tyler felt the number hit him like a physical blow. $8,000 to $10,000 was more money than Sarah Johnson probably made in 6 months. It might as well have been $1 million for someone in her situation. But as Tyler looked around the small house, seeing the carefully maintained cleanliness despite the structural problems, the baby clothes folded neatly in preparation for a child who would have no safe place to sleep, he felt something awakening inside him that had nothing to do with logic or financial calculations. "Frank," Tyler said quietly, his voice trembling slightly, "what if I paid for the repairs?" Frank stopped examining the ceiling and turned to stare at Tyler with an expression of profound surprise. "Son, that's a lot of money." "I know, but—" Tyler looked toward the living room where Sarah and Linda were talking in hushed, worried tones. "I've been making good money and spending it on things that don't matter. Maybe it's time I spent it on something that does." Frank's weathered face broke into a smile that carried more pride than Tyler had ever seen from his own father. "Tyler, you understand what you're saying? This isn't a loan or an investment. This is just giving." Tyler nodded, feeling more certain of this decision than he had ever felt about anything in his life. "I understand, and I want to do it." Frank placed a strong hand on Tyler's shoulder with the affection of a father whose son had just become a man. "Then let's go tell those ladies that they don't have to worry anymore." When Tyler and Frank returned to the living room and explained that the repairs would be done at no cost, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Linda Johnson collapsed into Frank's arms, sobbing with relief. Sarah covered her face and wept with the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying unbearable stress for too long. "Why?" Sarah asked through her tears, looking directly at Tyler. "Why would you help strangers?" Tyler felt his own eyes burning with emotion as he struggled to find words for something he barely understood himself. "Because somebody recently taught me that being able to help someone means you should help someone." Frank's pride in his young protege was evident in every line of his face. He had taken an arrogant young engineer and helped him discover the kind of man he could become. The kind of man who would sacrifice his own comfort to ensure a pregnant woman had a safe place to bring her child into the world. As they began planning the repair work, Tyler realized that Frank had given him something infinitely more valuable than technical knowledge. He had given him a glimpse of what it meant to live with purpose, compassion, and the kind of strength that comes from lifting others up. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but in that small, damaged house, Tyler Hamilton was learning that the most important construction project of his life wasn't made of concrete and steel. It was built from kindness, one act of love at a time. 2 weeks after beginning the Johnson house repairs, Tyler's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, but he was already awake, staring at the ceiling of his apartment with the kind of restless energy that comes from discovering purpose. The past weeks had become a blur of meaningful work, splitting time between the construction site repairs and Sarah Johnson's house, learning from Frank with the hungry enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. His hands, now permanently stained with honest work, reached for the simple clothes that had replaced his expensive wardrobe. The man who once spent an hour perfecting his appearance now dressed in 5 minutes, eager to return to the world where Frank Thompson was teaching him what it truly meant to build something lasting. The Johnson house repairs had become more than just a construction project. They had evolved into a masterclass in compassion. Tyler watched daily as Frank interacted with Sarah and Linda, treating them with the respectful gentleness of someone who understood that pregnancy and poverty were not character flaws, but circumstances that required extra care and consideration. "Tyler, hand me that support beam," Frank called from inside the Johnson house, where they were installing the final ceiling joists. The old foreman's voice carried the easy familiarity of shared purpose. "Coming right up," Tyler responded, hefting the heavy wooden beam with muscles that had grown stronger through weeks of real labor. The physical demands of construction work had initially exhausted him, but now he found a deep satisfaction in the honest fatigue that came from meaningful effort. Sarah Johnson sat in the living room, her baby bump noticeably larger than when they had first met, watching the two men work with an expression of gratitude that never seemed to diminish. "Mr. Thompson, Tyler, I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this." Frank paused in his work to smile at the young mother with paternal warmth. "Sarah, honey, the only payment we need is knowing that you and that baby will be safe and comfortable." Tyler felt his chest tighten with emotion as he watched this exchange. Frank's natural generosity continued to amaze him. The old foreman gave of himself so freely, expecting nothing in return, that it seemed almost supernatural to someone who had spent his entire life calculating personal advantage in every interaction. Around noon, the sound of expensive car doors slamming outside the Johnson house made everyone pause. Through the window, Tyler could see a sleek black BMW parked on the cracked concrete driveway, looking as out of place in this modest neighborhood as a diamond ring in a toolbox. "Are you expecting someone?" Frank asked Sarah, who shook her head with obvious confusion. "Nobody I know drives a car like that," she replied, struggling to rise from her chair with the awkward movements of advanced pregnancy. Tyler walked to the front window and felt his breath catch in his throat. A distinguished man in an expensive suit was approaching the house, but it wasn't his clothing that made Tyler's heart race. It was the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affected thousands of people. "Frank," Tyler called softly, "I think you need to see this." The old foreman joined Tyler at the window, and for the first time since Tyler had known him, Frank Thompson's face went completely white. His weathered hands began to tremble slightly, and he stepped back from the window as if he had seen a ghost. "Frank?" Tyler asked, alarmed by his mentor's sudden change in demeanor. "Do you know who that is?" Before Frank could answer, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the small house. Sarah looked between Frank and Tyler with growing concern, sensing the sudden tension that had filled the room like smoke from a fire. Tyler opened the door to find himself face-to-face with Benjamin Crawford, a name he recognized from newspaper headlines and business magazines. Crawford was in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from building corporate empires, but his eyes showed an unusual mixture of nervousness and determination. "Good afternoon," Crawford said, his voice carrying the polished authority of boardroom presentations. "I'm looking for Frank Thompson. I was told I might find him here." Tyler glanced back at Frank, who had moved to the far corner of the room and seemed to be trying to disappear into the shadows. The old foreman's entire body language had changed. Gone was the confident master craftsman, replaced by someone who looked like he was bracing for painful news. "Mr. Thompson is here," Tyler said carefully. "But may I ask who's looking for him?" Crawford extended a business card with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to opening doors with his name alone. "Benjamin Crawford, Crawford Development Corporation. I've been searching for Frank for quite some time." The name hit Tyler like a physical blow. Crawford Development Corporation was one of the largest construction companies in Colorado, responsible for half the skyscrapers in downtown Denver. Benjamin Crawford was legendary in the construction industry, a man whose projects had shaped the entire region's skyline. "Frank!" Crawford called into the house, his voice carrying a mixture of authority and something that sounded almost like pleading. "Please, I know you're in there. I've driven 6 hours to find you." Frank emerged from the shadows with the reluctant movement of someone walking toward his own execution. His face showed a complex mixture of emotions, pain, resignation, and something that might have been old anger carefully controlled. "Hello, Benjamin," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "It's been a long time." Crawford's carefully composed business demeanor cracked immediately upon seeing Frank. Tears began forming in the older man's eyes as he stepped forward with obvious emotion. "Frank, my God, you look good. Older, but good." "What do you want, Benjamin?" Frank asked, his voice neutral but not hostile. "After all these years, why now?" Tyler felt like he was witnessing something monumentally important, though he couldn't understand what. The tension between these two men was palpable, loaded with history and unresolved issues that went far deeper than business relationships. Crawford glanced around the small, modest house, taking in the repair work, the simple furnishings, the obvious signs of financial struggle. His expression showed something between sadness and disbelief. "Frank, what are you doing here? Why are you—" Crawford seemed to struggle for words. "Why are you working as a foreman when you should be running your own company?" Sarah Johnson, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion, slowly lowered herself back into her chair. Tyler could see her trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. "Benjamin," Frank said with the patient tone of someone who had made peace with difficult circumstances, "my company doesn't exist anymore. You know that better than anyone." Crawford's face crumpled with visible anguish. "Frank, that's exactly why I'm here. I know what happened 25 years ago. I know about the embezzlement charges, the bankruptcy, everything. But Frank," Crawford's voice broke slightly, "I also know who really stole that money." The silence that followed was deafening. Tyler felt his world shifting on its axis as he began to understand that he was witnessing the revelation of some enormous injustice. "What are you saying?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Crawford reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Frank, my head accountant, Robert Martinez, confessed everything before he died last month. Cancer got him, and on his deathbed, he admitted that he embezzled the $400,000 from your company and framed you for it." Tyler felt his knees go weak. Frank Thompson, the humble foreman who had become his mentor and father figure, had been wrongly accused of a crime that destroyed his life. "He had gambling debts," Crawford continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Massive debts to people who would have killed him if he didn't pay. So he stole from your company accounts and made it look like you had authorized the transfers." Frank sat down heavily in one of Sarah's mismatched chairs, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had carried a terrible burden for decades. "Benjamin, why are you telling me this now? What difference does it make after all these years?" Crawford knelt down in front of Frank's chair, his expensive suit be damned. "Because I believed him, Frank. I believed Martinez when he showed me the forged documents with your signature. I believed him when he said you had stolen from your own company to pay for gambling debts." Tyler watched in horror as Crawford began to weep openly. "Frank, I destroyed an innocent man's life because I was too proud and too stupid to investigate properly. You were my best friend, my business partner, and I threw you away based on lies." The magnitude of this revelation hit Tyler like an avalanche. Frank Thompson wasn't just a skilled foreman. He had been a successful business owner, wrongly destroyed by the betrayal of people he trusted. "Frank," Crawford continued through his tears, "do you know what happened to your company after you were forced out?" Frank shook his head, his own eyes now showing the pain of old wounds being reopened. "It became the foundation of Crawford Development Corporation. I bought your assets for pennies on the dollar and built my empire on the ruins of your life. Crawford's voice was breaking completely now. Every building I've constructed, every success I've achieved, it was all built on the theft of your dreams. Sarah Johnson gasped audibly from her chair, her hands protectively covering her pregnant belly as if to shield her unborn child from the cruelty of what she was hearing. Tyler felt rage building in his chest, not just at Crawford's betrayal, but at his own earlier treatment of Frank. He had humiliated a man who had already suffered the worst kind of injustice imaginable. "Benjamin," Frank said with a calmness that stunned everyone in the room, "what's done is done. You can't give me back 25 years. But I can give you back your company," Crawford said desperately. "Frank, I want to transfer 50% of Crawford Development Corporation to you. It's worth over $200 million. You could have everything back, the wealth, the recognition, the respect." Tyler watched Frank's face carefully, expecting to see joy, relief, vindication, but instead, he saw something unexpected. Peace. "Benjamin," Frank said gently, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want your company." Crawford looked stunned. "But Frank, it's rightfully yours. I stole it from you." Frank smiled with a serenity that Tyler was only beginning to understand. "No, Benjamin. What you stole from me was 25 years ago. What I have now, the relationships, the purpose, the peace, nobody can steal that from me." Frank gestured around the small house where they sat. "You see poverty and failure when you look at this place. But I see Sarah, a brave young mother who's building a life for her child. I see Tyler, a young man who's learning that real wealth comes from serving others. I see work that matters, relationships that last, and a life that has meaning beyond profit margins." Crawford stared at Frank as if he were speaking a foreign language. "But Frank, you could be rich again. You could have anything you want." Frank's smile broadened, and Tyler saw in it the wisdom that had transformed his own life. "Benjamin, I already have everything I want. I have work that serves people who need help. I have young men like Tyler who remind me that every person deserves a chance to become better than they were yesterday. And I have the knowledge that my life matters not because of what I own, but because of how I treat the people around me." Tyler felt tears streaming down his face as he finally understood the depth of Frank Thompson's character. This man had lost everything, been betrayed by his closest friends, and spent decades rebuilding his life from nothing. And he had done it without bitterness, without revenge, without losing his capacity for love and generosity. "Frank," Tyler said, his voice thick with emotion, "you're not just a foreman. You're not just a good man. You're a legend, a living legend who's been teaching me how to be human." Frank looked at Tyler with the pride of a father whose son had finally understood the most important lesson of his life. "Tyler, the only legend that matters is the one written in the hearts of people whose lives you've touched with kindness." Crawford sat back on his heels, staring at Frank with obvious amazement. "How do you do it, Frank? How do you not hate me? How are you not consumed with bitterness?" Frank reached out and placed a gentle hand on Crawford's shoulder. "Because bitterness is a poison you drink hoping someone else will die. I chose life, Benjamin. I chose love. I chose to build people instead of just buildings." In that small, humble house, Tyler Hamilton witnessed the most profound lesson of his life. That true greatness isn't measured by wealth or recognition, but by the grace with which we treat others, especially those who have wronged us. Frank Thompson had shown him that the strongest foundations aren't made of concrete and steel, but of forgiveness, compassion, and the courage to choose love even when life gives you every reason to choose hate. The legend wasn't what Frank had lost. The legend was who he had become. 4 weeks after Benjamin Crawford's shocking revelation, Tyler Hamilton stared at his reflection, barely recognizing the man looking back. Gone were the polished clothes and arrogant posture. In their place stood someone whose calloused hands spoke of honest labor, whose eyes carried confidence earned through character rather than demanded through intimidation. The completed Johnson house had become sacred to Tyler's heart. Baby Gabriella slept safely in her nursery, a room that existed because Tyler had chosen compassion over selfishness. The memory of Frank cradling that newborn, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, remained etched in Tyler's soul. This morning carried unusual weight. Tyler felt compelled toward something terrifying yet exhilarating. publicly honoring the man who had reconstructed his very humanity. At the construction site, the morning huddle had become Tyler's most cherished ritual. Where once he felt anxiety facing experienced workers, now he discovered daily opportunities to learn from people whose wisdom transcended textbook knowledge. "Morning, everyone," Frank called out, his voice carrying natural authority earned through decades of patient service. "Let's make sure we all return safely to our families tonight." Tyler studied the familiar faces. Miguel Rodriguez with his gentle strength, Sarah Chen with determined competence, Juan Silva, whose humor brightened the darkest workdays. These people had become his chosen family. "Tyler," Frank said warmly, "could you update everyone on yesterday's structural inspection?" Months earlier, addressing this group would have triggered Tyler's compulsive need to prove superiority. Now it felt like family sharing news around the dinner table. "The final inspection exceeded every expectation," Tyler reported, genuine pride replacing former arrogance. "Our reinforcement work earned rating 70% above specifications. The city inspector requested our documentation for their reference library." Murmurs of approval rippled through the circle. Miguel nodded with quiet satisfaction, and Tyler felt warm recognition that comes from earning respect through humility. "But everyone needs to understand something crucial," Tyler continued, his voice strengthening with conviction. "Every breakthrough innovation came from Frank Thompson's intuitive understanding. My role was simply following guidance from someone with 40 years of wisdom." Frank's weathered face flushed with embarrassment, his natural humility making him shift uncomfortably. But Tyler had learned some truths, demanded expression, regardless of personal comfort. "Actually," Tyler said, voice trembling with emotion, "I need to say something I should have said months ago. Something shame prevented me from acknowledging publicly." The circle grew unnaturally quiet. Workers shifted nervously, sensing vulnerability about to be exposed. Frank looked as though he wanted to stop Tyler, but Tyler couldn't be deterred. "When I first arrived," Tyler began, voice cracking, "I treated Frank Thompson with cruelty that still makes me sick. I called him outdated, incompetent, a relic. I humiliated him in front of all of you with sadistic pleasure, thinking education gave me permission to destroy another person's dignity." Deafening silence followed. Some workers stared at their boots, remembering scenes they wished they could forget. Others watched Tyler with expressions mixing sympathy for his pain with respect for his courage. "Frank Thompson is the finest human being I've ever encountered," Tyler continued, tears flowing freely. "Everything good I've learned about construction, about work, about treating people with basic human decency, it all comes from his patient teaching." Miguel stepped forward slightly, his own eyes glistening. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks, while Joao's usual smile became solemn recognition of something sacred occurring. "Frank Thompson saved my soul," Tyler declared, voice growing stronger despite tears. "He took a cruel, arrogant young man and, through patience, kindness, and love I'd never experienced, showed me what it means to be truly human." The profound silence felt holy. Several workers openly wept, understanding they were witnessing extraordinary transformation, public confession, revealing the depths of change possible when love encounters willingness to grow. Frank stepped forward, placing both hands on Tyler's shoulders with a father's firm grip. "Tyler, son, you don't need to carry that shame anymore. What matters isn't who you were. It's who you've chosen to become. I became who I am because you showed me how," Tyler replied, voice thick with bottomless gratitude. "Because you loved me when I was unlovable and saw potential when I only displayed cruelty." 2 hours later, David Richardson approached Tyler with the serious demeanor of someone about to deliver life-changing news. His usual casual manner had been replaced by formal corporate bearing. "Tyler, I need to discuss something significant," Richardson said, gesturing toward the office with unusual formality. Inside the office, Richardson faced Tyler with an expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal bewilderment. "Tyler, when you first arrived, I was convinced you'd be terminated within 30 days, Richardson began. "Your treatment of Frank, your dismissive attitude toward experienced workers. I was actually drafting dismissal paperwork." Tyler felt his stomach clench with shame as memories flooded back. The arrogance, the cruelty, the casual dismissal of people whose wisdom he hadn't recognized. But the transformation in your character has been unprecedented, Richardson continued, which is why corporate is offering you regional engineering director, 9 construction sites, 18 engineers under your supervision, 60% salary increase. Tyler's heart raced, but not with ambitious excitement. Instead, he felt complex gratitude mixed with growing apprehension. The position requires immediate relocation to Dallas, Richardson added with finality. You'd begin within 2 weeks, which means transitioning away from your mentorship with Frank. Tyler felt struck by a sledgehammer. Leaving Frank felt like abandoning a father who had patiently rebuilt him from fragments. May I have time to consider this carefully? Tyler asked slowly. Richardson's eyebrows rose with surprise. Tyler, this is career-defining. Most engineers would accept immediately. I've learned that crucial decisions shouldn't be made impulsively, especially when they affect people you love. Frank is a foreman with high school education. You're an MIT graduate with unlimited potential. Don't allow sentiment to compromise your advancement. The words hit Tyler like physical blows. Months earlier, he would have agreed completely. Now, they sounded cruel in their fundamental misunderstanding of human value. Frank Thompson possesses wisdom no university can teach, Tyler replied firmly. My potential means nothing if advancing it requires abandoning the person who made me worthy of that potential. That afternoon, Tyler found Frank working alone, meticulously inspecting final structural connections with concentrated attention that understood careless work could endanger lives. Frank, Tyler called softly. I need to discuss something weighing heavily on my heart. Frank immediately stopped work, turning with patient attention and gentle concern. Richardson offered me a major promotion today. Regional Engineering Director, 9 sites, Dallas headquarters, 60% increase. Frank's face showed surprise, followed by pride, mixed with sadness. A parent whose child has achieved something wonderful that will take them far away. That's tremendous news, son. You've earned it. Frank, accepting means leaving Denver immediately, leaving this project, leaving you. Frank remained quiet for an extended moment, studying Tyler's face like architectural plans determining structural stability. When I first started working with young engineers, I mistakenly believed my job was keeping them close permanently, Frank said finally. Experience taught me that a good teacher's responsibility is preparing students for independent success. But I'm still learning so much from you daily. I'm not ready to work without your guidance. Frank smiled with gentle wisdom that had become Tyler's anchor. Son, recognizing how much you still need to learn is exactly the proof I need that you're ready for greater responsibilities. What if I revert to who I used to be? What if success makes me arrogant again? Frank placed a steady hand on Tyler's shoulder with unconditional love's reassurance. Tyler, you could never become that person again, because that person was never real. He was just a frightened young man hiding behind credentials. The real Tyler, the one I've watched emerge, is someone I'm proud to call my son. The word son struck Tyler with overwhelming force. His biological father had never spoken with the pride and love he heard in Frank's voice. Before Tyler could respond, commotion from below drew their attention. Looking down, Tyler saw news vans, business-suited people, and camera equipment being assembled with urgent efficiency. We're about to have unexpected company, Tyler said anxiously. Richardson's voice boomed through a megaphone. All workers gather in the staging area immediately. We have special visitors with an important announcement. 25 minutes later, the entire crew assembled around a makeshift platform where news cameras were positioned. Tyler stood protectively beside Frank, both uncertain about what was unfolding, but united in mutual support. Benjamin Crawford stepped onto the platform, his commanding presence immediately silencing nervous chatter. Behind him stood Channel 7's lead reporter and other media representatives. Ladies and gentlemen, Crawford began, voice trembling with emotion. I've brought these journalists to publicly address a terrible injustice hidden for 25 years, an injustice that destroyed an innocent man's life. Tyler felt Frank tense beside him, moving closer protectively as the old foreman's breathing became shallow. 25 years ago, I destroyed the life and reputation of an innocent man based on lies, Crawford continued, voice shaking. That man lost his successful engineering company, his financial security, his professional reputation. Because I was too proud and foolish to investigate before passing judgment. Crawford pointed directly at Frank. That man is Frank Thompson, standing here among you, not as the successful business owner he should be, but as a construction foreman because my betrayal forced him to rebuild his entire life from nothing. Collective gasps rippled through workers. Tyler watched Frank's face pale as his most painful chapter was exposed to public scrutiny. Frank Thompson was wrongly accused of embezzling $400,000 from his own company. Crawford's voice strengthened, despite visible tears. The real thief was my accountant, who confessed on his deathbed last month. Frank Thompson is completely innocent, and I built my fortune on the foundation of his destroyed dreams. The silence was deafening. Tyler felt tears flowing as he witnessed public vindication of the man who had become his father in every meaningful way. The reporter stepped forward. Mr. Crawford, why make this confession publicly? Crawford's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Frank. Because Frank Thompson deserves more than private apology. He deserves public recognition that he's not just innocent, but one of the finest humans I've known. Even after I destroyed his life, he spent these years quietly helping others, teaching young people, building character in everyone he touches. Crawford's voice broke completely. Frank could have chosen bitterness. He could have chosen revenge. Instead, he chose love, forgiveness, and service. He represents everything good about humanity. The reporter turned to Frank. Mr. Thompson, would you respond? Frank stepped forward, his weathered face showing complex emotions. When he spoke, his voice carried quiet dignity, Tyler associated with true greatness. Thank you, Benjamin, for your courage. But I want everyone to understand. I don't feel like a victim. I feel like a man given the opportunity to discover what really matters. Frank's gaze swept the assembled workers, many wiping tears. When I lost my company, I thought life was over. But losing everything I thought I wanted taught me to appreciate everything I actually needed. Meaningful work, genuine relationships, and the privilege of helping young people discover their potential. Frank's eyes found Tyler. This young man, Tyler Hamilton, came here as an arrogant engineer who thought degrees made him superior. I watched him transform into someone whose character matches his intelligence. That transformation means more than any business success. Tyler couldn't contain himself longer. He stepped forward, voice strong despite streaming tears. Everyone needs to understand something, Tyler declared. Frank Thompson didn't just teach me construction. He taught me how to be human.
He showed me that real strength comes from lifting others up, that true wisdom comes from humility, and that the greatest construction project is building character in ourselves and others. Tyler's voice broke with emotion. Frank Thompson is the father I never had, the teacher I never deserved, and the example I'll spend my lifetime following. He didn't just change my career, he saved my soul.
The site erupted in spontaneous applause as workers who had witnessed Tyler's transformation showed their support. Frank stepped down and embraced Tyler with fierce paternal love. Tyler, Frank whispered, voice thick with emotion. You've become everything I hoped and more than I dared dream. Because you showed me how, Tyler whispered back. Because you loved me when I was unlovable. Later that evening, as media crews departed and workers headed home, Tyler and Frank sat together watching sunset over Denver's skyline. A skyline Frank had helped build as a successful engineer and was now expanding as a humble foreman. Frank, Tyler said quietly, I've decided about the promotion. Frank turned with patient attention, trusting Tyler's judgment completely. I'm declining the offer. I'm staying here with you, learning until you decide I'm truly ready to lead others with the wisdom and character they deserve. Frank showed genuine surprise. Tyler, that's a significant opportunity to refuse. You taught me some things matter more than career advancement. Loyalty is one, gratitude is another, and love, the kind that transforms people, is most important of all. Tyler looked over the site that had become sacred ground. Besides, my real education is just beginning. I want to learn not just how to be a better engineer, but how to be someone who leaves the world better than he found it. Frank smiled with profound satisfaction. Tyler, do you know the greatest gift a teacher can receive? What? A student who becomes not just competent, but wise. Not just successful, but good. Tyler felt truth settle into his heart like a foundation stone. Then I hope I can continue being worthy of your teaching. Frank placed a paternal hand on Tyler's shoulder as they watched final light fade. "Son, you already are. And that's not because of what you've learned about construction. It's because of what you've learned about love." Tyler understood that life's most important lesson couldn't be found in textbooks. It was written in the patient example of a man who had chosen forgiveness over bitterness, service over success, and love over everything else. Frank Thompson had taught him that the strongest foundations aren't built from concrete and steel, but from character, compassion, and the courage to choose kindness, even when life gives every reason to choose otherwise. The legend wasn't what Frank had lost or built with his hands. The legend was who he had chosen to become, and who he had helped others become. And Tyler Hamilton would spend his life honoring that legacy, one act of love at a time.